Everybody got quiet. It must be time to start. Welcome to the College of Law. Thanks for joining us for this celebration of Constitution Day. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a professor and associate dean here at the college. Today's panel discussion is about last month's events in Charlottesville, Virginia, and their national aftermath. Before our panelists delve into the legal nuances of these events, I feel obliged to say that some things about Charlottesville aren't nuanced at all. Probably one of the lessons of Charlottesville is that you can go very wrong by asserting the existence of moral nuance where there really isn't any. There's no moral nuance to the question whether you should go marching at night with a bunch of torch-wielding white supremacists who are chanting blood and soil. You shouldn't. But even granting the questions about white supremacy lack moral nuance, there's still plenty to talk about where Charlottesville is concerned, particularly by way of legal nuance. To discuss these legal nuances and constitutional nuances, we're joined by a panel of four very distinguished law professors. Tammy Walker, who is a visiting assistant professor at the college and the college's Larry Ripstein Fellow. Andy Leopold, who is the Edwin Adams Professor of Law and serves as director of the college's program on criminal law and procedure. Robin Wilson, who is the Roger and Stephanie Joslin Professor of Law and Director of the college's program in Family Law and Policy. And finally, Jason Mazzoni, who is the Albert E. Jenner Professor of Law and Director of the college's program in Constitutional Law, Constitutional Theory, History, and Law. So without further ado, Jason, would you like to start?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for coming. As Eric said, this is our Constitution Day event. Constitution Day is September 17th. It's the day in 1787 that the delegates in Philadelphia signed the Constitution and then send it off. So I was glad that today's panel was described as the legal issues in the context of Charlottesville, because the first thing I wanted to say, and I say this in sort of every Constitution Day speech that I give, is that the Constitution doesn't answer every single question about every social and political issue, either those at Charlottesville or in any other context. I mean, this is it's a fairly short document. If you were, for example, a lawyer and your client is the city of Charlottesville or University of Virginia, and you were preparing a memo to talk about maybe different kinds of steps you might take in the future in order to respond to the recent events. 90% of your memo would not be about the U.S. Constitution. Maybe 10% would. The 90% would be about the state constitution, state statutory law, state Supreme Court decisions, various sorts of regulatory provisions, and so on. So keep that in mind. Even though the Constitution is there in the background, there are other important sources of law, and I'm going to mention them along the way today. But it is Constitution Day, so I do want to say something about the Constitution. I plan to talk about three amendments to the Constitution: the first, the second, and the 14th. So let's start with the first, and there's two provisions that are relevant to what we saw happen in Charlottesville. One is the speech clause, right, of the First Amendment. The other is the assembly clause. These are interrelated provisions: ability to speak, but the ability also to come together with others in an assembly, a gathering, march, protest, as we saw in Charlottesville, to collectively disseminate a message. So let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. Spraying somebody with pepper or mace, beating somebody with a club, right? This is not protected by the First Amendment, right? This is conduct. Some conduct is expressive, but if the government is going after the conduct, not because of the expressive component, but because of the underlying conduct itself, then that doesn't raise any sort of First Amendment concerns. So the guy who drives the vehicle into the crowd is guilty of criminal conduct, is going to prison. Right? It's not a First Amendment issue, even though he might say, "I was just making a point." Right? And so that's easy. The other easy thing is a question: is there a right under the First Amendment to gather in a public park and shout anti-Semitic messages, racist messages? Yes. easy answer to that. Government's ability to regulate based on conduct is extremely restricted under the First Amendment, and in particular, there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. So a lot of what happened in Charlottesville is described as hate speech. We hear about hate speech in the media quite a lot, but it's not a First Amendment concept. You can be as obnoxious, hateful as you like under the First Amendment. It's not a provision that only protects your right to be nice to people. So no hate speech exception. That said, the First Amendment is not absolute. It does say make no law. Sounds absolute. The way that the courts interpret it, though, is that it's not absolute, and so there is some possibility of regulation. I wanted to raise a couple of things, sort of point to the way in which there might be sort of future interventions here if we see repetitions of what we saw in Charlottesville, but also to think about what actually happened in Charlottesville and some of the shortcomings there, perhaps on the part of relevant actors. So two categories of speech that get very minimal, if any, First Amendment protection. One is what we refer to as fighting words. I think we saw some of that in Charlottesville. And this it's what it sounds like. It's in your face, face-to-face insults, statements that are very likely to provoke a violent reaction, a fight, right, from the person that they're directed at. This is not, generally making an offensive statement. It's a statement that is targeted at a particular individual and is likely to provoke a response. The Supreme Court developed this doctrine some years ago as sort of a carve-out to the First Amendment. Government can regulate it, can punish it. The court's not so crazy about it anymore, I think for a couple of reasons. One is that it's sort of hard to limit that kind of thing in advance because nobody says, my plan is to engage in fighting words during the march. It's so hard to limit in advance. And then after the fact, if a fight does break out, you have the possibility of prosecution for assault. And that's usually just a better avenue. Second kind of category that might be relevant to these sorts of events is what we call true threats. And so government can punish threats, true threats. So this is where the speaker means to communicate an intent to commit an act of violence and puts the listener in fear that violence is going to occur. So an example of this, in a case called Virginia versus Black, the Supreme Court held that under an appropriately crafted law, Virginia did not actually have one in the case, but under an appropriately crafted law, the state could punish burning a cross on your neighbor's lawn because with an intent to intimidate, right, even though there might be an expressive component to that. It's a threat and would reasonably understood by the person who sees it, views it as a threat of violence. Again, though, this is a fairly limited category. Right? We're talking about violence that is likely to occur fairly immediately, and it's directed at somebody who's actually there. So, hard to say that somebody watching on television, for example, what happened in Charlottesville, would be able to claim that they were a victim of a true threat. And again, hard to limit this sort of speech in advance. Punishment afterwards depends upon the existence of a state criminal statute. And here I think, crafting, as Virginia had, as some other states too, a statute that deals specifically with cross burning is a fairly neat, well-confined statute. But if what you encounter is Tiki Lamps, then unless you have a statute in place that is appropriately crafted, then the possibility of a state criminal conviction might not exist. And then there's this sort of additional wrinkle that if you show up and place the cross and burn it on somebody's lawn, that's a true threat. But how about if you're having a march and a bunch of other people actually come to watch? Can they take advantage of or invoke that notion of true threat, or can the government do so on their behalf when they are in some way willing participants in the spectacle? And here I wanted to mention a couple of additional things. One is with respect to the Tiki Lamps, right, the torches that are carried on the UVA campus. The University of Virginia, it turns out, does actually have an open flame prohibition, right? So you can't burn things on campus, and lots of places have this, without permission from relevant officials. That could potentially have been invoked with respect to the marchers on the University of Virginia campus. But a couple couple of problems. One is that the police, university police, were not aware, evidently, in the particular context of whether permission had been granted or not. And the university is fairly permissive in terms of granting people the right to burn things. If you go to UVA, there's lots of undergraduates with barbecues, for example, and so I think some question about whether that could be used against the marchers in that context when the university is permissive in most other settings. Okay, so two categories of speech are sort of kind of beyond the scope of the First Amendment, and then third, way in which government can regulate, and this I think is sort of more fruitful, is what we call time, place, manner restrictions. So you're talking here about speech that is protected by the First Amendment, but the government does have some ability to regulate when, where, how you get your message across, and this makes sense. We don't want people, for example, tying up traffic or blocking bridges or preventing people from entering buildings and so on. And so the Supreme Court has recognized this time, place, manner doctrine that says that so long as the regulation is content neutral, so the government's not looking at preferring some speakers over others, and the regulation is narrowly tailored to a significant government interest, like order, then there is the ability of the government to regulate. A couple of odd things here, though. One is that UVA, which is a state entity, does not evidently have in place any sort of regulatory framework that, for example, we have here at the University of Illinois that sets out, ways in which you can go about applying for a permit to conduct a rally and so on. So there's no sort of time, place, or manner rules at the University of Virginia. In the past, it's just been a kind of free-for-all. And so that's a problem. It's a problem because if such a thing were in place, then the nighttime rally, for example, might be the kind of thing that could be rescheduled out of concerns of disruption. But it's also a problem because it meant that UVA could not invoke time, place, or manner restrictions given the absence of that framework at the time. Second thing about time, place, and manner when we get to the city, because remember, the next day you have the march in Emancipation Park. Charlottesville does have time, place, manner rules and regularly deploys them. And Charlottesville had initially granted the marchers the right to march together in Emancipation Park, and then yanked the permit, citing time, place, manner concerns, saying specifically crowd control can be difficult in this park. We're going to send you a mile away where crowd control will be easier. And Kessler, the people who are marching, go to district court, get an injunction against that. The district court holds that what Charlottesville is doing is not really relying upon neutral time, place, manner criteria. It's going after this group because of the content of their speech, and that's unconstitutional. All right. So, but there is an ability to do that if it's done in a neutral way. So with all of that said, our First Amendment vision is that objectionable, hateful, racist, anti-Semitic speech is protected, right? That has to be your starting point. There are some exceptions, but they are exceptions. Don't think of the exceptions as the starting point. And the answer to objectionable speech is more speech. More speech, more assemblies doesn't mean louder, right? You drown out the other side. The answer is a response, and that's our First Amendment vision. And if you don't like that, you say, I'll take what's behind door number 2 instead. What's behind door number 2? The government, right? Government gets to decide who speaks, when they speak, what they can say, and so on. And if you think, maybe that would be better because I don't like what I saw in Charlottesville, you have to ask yourself two things. One is, what are the odds that the people who are in government right now and the majority that support them will, if given power, regulate speech in a way that aligns better, right, with my own political preferences? And if you say yes to that, then you have to ask yourself the next question, which is how about 4 years from now, where there's a change in government? And so we sort of go back to what might not be a perfect alternative, but which is probably better than government response. Okay. very quickly then, Second Amendment, so free speech, okay, that all sounds fine, but what about free speech plus guns, right? Does that alter this whole notion of the marketplace of ideas? Some of the people after Charlottesville said, the problem was that there's this sort of tension, this clash between First Amendment and Second Amendment. The presence of guns alters everything. I don't think that's quite right. The reason that you saw heavily armed individuals marching in Charlottesville is not because, at least not so far, because of the Second Amendment or any Supreme Court decision based upon the Second Amendment that may be reflective of Second Amendment values. It's reflective of extremely permissive open carry laws in Virginia, with very little ability on the part of localities like Charlottesville to intervene to shut those down. Right? So these are statutory protections in Virginia. That's the reason that you see that you saw what you saw. And so I think there are reasonable questions. What is the impact on speech, on the marketplace of ideas when you have that kind of mix, and what might be the impact on policing and the ways in which rallies occur? Do the police now have to kind of outgun everybody else in order for free speech exchanges to occur? What happens with respect to those who are inclined to respond? Or do they have to show up, and will they show up equally armed? And we saw some of that in Charlottesville, right? Violence that was committed by different groups of individuals. I think legitimate question there. But again, this is mostly a function of Virginia law rather than the Constitution. And finally, on the 14th Amendment, I just want to mention two things. The due process clause, there have been some lawsuits filed now by individuals who claim that their due process rights, federal due process rights, were violated because they were attacked and the police just kind of stood by. Right? That's what they say. Police stood by. Police should have come to their aid. That's a losing argument. The Supreme Court has said in a couple of cases that government police don't really owe you, as a federal constitutional matter, right, a duty of protection, even if you think they might, except in some very narrow circumstances. And then equal protection. I think that there's a kind of old idea that the Equal Protection Clause actually did confer a kind of obligation upon the government to affirmatively protect individuals from violence at the hands of other private parties, but that's not the view of the current Supreme Court. And now equal protection is all about same-sex marriage and that sort of stuff. So that ship, I think, has really sailed. But if you're kind of originalist type, you might be able to create that sort of argument. Last things on equal protection, then I'll sit down. A question about the monuments themselves, right? And so does the presence of the monuments themselves somehow violate the Equal Protection Clause because of the message that they send? I think at some point some government speech would probably raise an equal protection problem. So if the government puts up racist banners around town, or prints anti-Semitic messages on the currency or something like that, at some point government speech probably raises an equal protection concern. Monuments, a little hard. What is the message of the monument? What can you attribute to the government in that context? So there has been some talk about maybe the sheer presence is an equal protection problem. I think it's going to face an uphill battle if it gets litigated rather than resolved through the political process. Last thing, you might put some of these things together, and instead of Jefferson and UVA, think Lincoln and Illinois. And what I mean by that is think Reconstruction rather than the founding. Think 1868 rather than 1789 or 1791. Right? Think about racially targeted and threatening speech by people carrying weapons, or historical use of tortures by the Klan in rallies as a means of intimidation, and use of tortures, lynchings, of course, local law enforcement kind of standing by, special burdens upon racial minorities. Virginia, the state that rebelled, right, the home of the capital of the Confederacy. And find in Charlottesville an analog in reconstructed rights responsive to violence at the state and local level in the decades after the Civil War, right, an efforts to ensure that racial minorities were protected, right, and think then about the First Amendment through an equal protection framework, if you like. So maybe that's doorway number 3. It's not a very viable doorway, because if you open that door, there's really only one justice behind that doorway. One's not 5, right? So it's not enough. Who's that? It's Justice Thomas, actually. He has something of that idea, at least in some narrow circumstances, and you can see his dissenting opinion in Virginia versus Black. Okay, thank you.
So if you're like me, I'm always so impressed by Jason. He took the entire Constitution and went whoop right across all of it. So that was really good. Takes a lot of pressure off me because I wasn't going to talk about the Constitution. I want to talk about common sense ideas. And I want to start with some history about myself. So I thought I was on this panel because I went to UVA for 7 years. I'm what they call a double who. Not just a who, but a double who. Now, do we have any folks that went to UVA here? Interestingly enough, on this panel, and a few, okay. And then, anybody grow up in the Commonwealth of Virginia as I did? Okay, so a couple of us. So for those folks, this won't be a lesson, but I think it's helpful to understand Charlottesville. Virginia has always had 3 different sets of people living in it. There's Northern Virginia, in the District of Columbia, which is very wealthy. I don't know where y'all grew up, but it's very wealthy. It tends to be blue. It's very democratic. This is, in fact, one of the reasons that you see the state flip-flopping in political elections, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. And sometimes it wins in the sense of carrying an election, and sometimes it doesn't. It can also be very much resented by some of the rest of the state. Then you have the area that I grew up in, which is Tidewater, Virginia, in a little place called Hickory, about 4 miles from the North Carolina border. That area actually is very progressive and very cosmopolitan in some ways, in the sense that you have the military, you have lots of folks who have biracial families. My son, for example, is Filipino. His father was a naturalized citizen. You see a lot of that in the Tidewater area. And then you see also in the Tidewater area folks who are deeply not progressive, i.e. on the topic that Jason just talked about, guns or the military or certain things. So you see the sort of splintering in the Tidewater area. And then you have the Appalachia. And in the Appalachia, which is Southwest Virginia, you have deep, deep poverty. And lots of people, in fact, that's where we see the opioid crisis raging. And you see a lot of people who felt left behind. So what happens in Charlottesville? It's like those 3 parts of the state that never meet. We're all invited to one big party, right, on the downtown mall. Now, the second point that I wanted to make, which is a common sense point, is that I've been to beer festivals that had more protection or safety than they had on the downtown mall. Like, you have a perimeter around the beer festival. Why? Because they want to charge you an inordinate amount of money to try, I like IPAs. Now, I was talking to Andy yesterday, so I'm going to embarrass him for a second. Does everybody know what an IPA is, an Indian Pale Ale? Andy didn't, so we need to take Andy to distill. Okay, he didn't know. So we're going to take him, or you'll take him, I'm sure, now that I've told you, okay? But I really like IPAs. You go to a beer festival for $50, you can try like 30 IPAs. You need a DD or somebody on the subway to get you home, but you can try 30 beers, okay? How is it possible that there's more safety at a beer festival than inviting these parts of Virginia all into close proximity and then hoping for the best? Right? This seems impossible. Okay, 1/3 point also from Virginia, from the Tidewater area. I go this summer, as I do a lot, to see my mom. And I'm rolling up to Mom's house, and there's a kid who's 16, not so far away from where she lives, standing outside near the road with a gun on his hip, right? And I have to pause for a second. I'm like, what is he doing? And I'm thinking, oh, okay, it's hunting season. Then I'm trying to think, oh, what hunting season is it exactly? In any event, he's standing out there, and it really threw me for a loop, okay? You have to pause and remember that that is completely open in Virginia. It's stunning. It's stunning. And then you have these folks armed like that, all coming to a place where we're supposed to talk about issues. And then the last final point, there was a gentleman at my mom's house, a contractor working, and I said something about the kid outside. That was probably in front of my mom. It was probably the wrong move. Anyway, so the contractor starts in about guns, and he had guns in his car, and he and his wife, they carry their guns in their cars, I don't know why, and they were going to Canada, or they were actually going to Vermont, and they get to a part of Vermont where you could slip over to Canada. I don't know exactly where in Vermont. But anyway, you could just slip over to Canada. It's a pocket. And so they were there, and they thought they'd just go for a few minutes and see and hang out. So they get to the Border Patrol, and the Border Patrol asks all these questions, not the least of which is, do you have guns in your car? Right? And they're like, we don't do that in Canada. And so you can go up and make a U-turn and come back in on this side. So they get to the other side, and the Border Patrol says, how long have you been in Canada? And the guy says, about 5 minutes, and I'm done with it, I don't want to be, and then he goes, oh, let me guess, you have guns in your car. Because apparently it happens all the time. And he offers the Border Patrol man to hold their little guns so that they could go spend a few hours, which was really nice, although I found that unfathomable, but that they would hold somebody's guns. But at any rate, that they were going to hold those guns so that they could go rolling around in Canada for a few hours and see it. And he goes, no, I've had that's enough of Canada for us. And so they said no, right? What should have happened with the tiki torches and the semi-automatic weapons is when they rolled up to that perimeter, the person said, if you want to come in here, you're going to leave your tiki torch and your gun at the gate. And I think all of those people would have been like the contractor at my mom's house and said, no, thank you. I'm out of here. Now, you can see that Andy and I practiced this yesterday. And when I said that, Andy said to me, well, where are they going to go? And my answer was, who cares? Not here. And I think that's what should have happened. Thank you.
Let me try to get back some of my dignity. My wife and I lived in Virginia for 5 years and Charlottesville for 3 while I was in law school, and it was impossible, of course, not to think about those times during the events in August. I was sad that a place that had meant a lot to me and a lot to a lot of people, that at least for now it's going to be remembered as a place of ugliness rather than a place of education and history. I was proud that so many of the people I don't know, but I kind of feel like I did know them, were courageous in the face of danger when I wouldn't have blamed them a bit if they decided to stay in their room. And I was selfishly glad not to be there now. My African-American son had enough difficulty digesting the events from 1,000 miles away, and I was glad he was spared, at least for now, the closest shock wave of hate. I was also mildly amused by a lot of the public reactions to the events in Charlottesville, moving past the foolishness of ESPN not wanting announcer Robert Lee to broadcast a Virginia football game, although it did make me worry that ESPN announcer Tom Jackson was probably due to be suspended somehow. And some media outlets engaged in serious discussions about whether there should be statues of Confederate generals, even though I'm a little skeptical that 1 person in 5 knows the difference between Nathan Bedford Forrest and Forrest Gump. Because I think the events in Charlottesville were as much about statues as the lunch counter protests during the civil rights movement were about getting something to eat. I also twitched a little when I saw the events described in my alumni magazine as, quote, when hate came to town, and how the events began with, quote, largely outside elements. Okay, fair enough. It's largely true, and it's an alumni magazine. But I remembered very well the conversations, many conversations, I had with my wife, who was working at the UVA hospital while I was in law school, where she often would care for the local poor who didn't have anywhere else to go, and who often were treated as if they were, well, poor and didn't have anywhere else to go. And so while I was sitting at the law school with my group of friends who were quite diverse, I think they came from all the Ivy League schools, she was hearing stories and many times experiencing some of the racial, cultural, and wealth divide that now makes me wonder how much of the really explosive tension of this past summer really had to be imported. But I was only a little annoyed because it was a long time ago that we lived there. It was, our experiences there were overwhelmingly positive, and I'm generally an optimistic guy, and I'm hopeful that things have improved there. My final reaction, though, to the events in Charlottesville was really a sense of disappointment. What's been missing, at least for me, in the aftermath of Charlottesville is a sense of what's next. What can we do to reduce the chances that this will happen again in Charlottesville, in Berkeley, in Champaign? It is important to condemn bigotry, just as it's important to prevent violence. But I worry that we're increasingly in a world where we not only want to stop the violence, as we should, but we also think we have to stop the speech and not respond to it. I've listened, maybe not carefully enough, for opinion leaders generally and universities in particular to waiting to hear ideas, suggestions, and arguments for ways to fight racism with reason and with persuasion, rather than with attempts to shout louder and keep anyone else from hearing ideas that I find abhorrent. Universities should be the one place on earth where white supremacists, progressives, the alt-left, the alt-right, the alt-middle, if there is such a thing, can talk instead of shout. Now, civilized behavior has to be the price of admission, and firearms should be checked at the door, literally and figuratively. But we in a university setting have been given a special privilege, I think, one that allows us to let reason mix with passion in a controlled environment, to embrace the idea of allowing different viewpoints to be aired without actually embracing the viewpoints themselves. But if we only talk to each other, the like-minded, sensible people who agree with us, and if our response to hateful ideas is to ignore it, suppress it, just call it bad and hope that it goes away, I think we've lost our best chance for making progress in the fight against intolerance. I know this sounds a little naive. There are large numbers of people, maybe all of them, who are carrying torches in Charlottesville who are not particularly amenable to reason and who have no interest in trying to support and defend their views like grown-ups. But the fact that most of these efforts will fail is not an excuse for those of us who want to make progress to skip the idea that the power of persuasion and education is the only way to make things better. It means being exposed to some really unpalatable stuff. But to close with the cliche, freedom of speech and freedom of thought isn't free. And if we can get people with hateful views into the same room as some of us, I like our chances. Let me now turn you over to Professor Walker.
Thank you. So I don't consider myself to be a particularly emotional person, but what happened in Charlottesville really did affect me in a way that I didn't expect. And I kind of had to think about why that is and what was it about this experience that really kind of had me being more emotional than I thought I would be. And I think the first thing I thought of was that even though I'm not originally from Charlottesville, I'm from Texas, Charlottesville is the longest place I've lived in my adult life. And for the 6 years that I was there, I lived in an apartment complex that was 2 blocks up and on the same street as the place where Heather Heyer died or was murdered. And so in addition to thinking about like that, I also thought about why Charlottesville and then why in this particular time? Because it's not like this is even the first sort of rally in Charlottesville this year. So why this city, why this time? And I thought about the other reason that I felt emotional about what happened in Charlottesville, and that's because I know how hard the city has worked to try to acknowledge the poor race relationships in the city and try to remedy them. And it's been a years-long process, nearly 10 years at least at this point, and I know how emotional those people must feel who've spent tons of times, millions of dollars trying to work towards something, only to have somebody sort of destroy it in a matter of a few hours. And so, and I think that's also part of the reason why, or part of the answer to the question of why Charlottesville. I think it's because they've had this concerted effort over years to try to work hard to address their ugly past, and that they made changes because of it. And those changes then threatened the people who aren't interested in any sort of thing like that, right? And so let me tell you a little bit about my experience. So I was in Charlottesville, not for law school, but for a PhD in community psychology. And as part of that program, we work with the city on various projects. The project that I worked on was, I was a member of the task force on racial disparity and disproportionality. This task force had all of the members of the city council, it had the police chief, there were no less than 30 civic leaders and government officials on this task force. And we were charged with trying to explore racial disparity and disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. So one thing that I have to say about that I think is kind of illustrative of the kind of place that Charlottesville is that I started working on this project in 2011, 2012. It's still going on. Every single meeting is open to the public. Every question we wanted to answer, every thought question we thought we needed to answer, how we went about answering, all of those things were open to the public. We had city council meetings where one thing about Charlottesville is you can say whatever you want in city council meetings, and they don't ever table anything. They go on until they finish the agenda, and that's how it is. So I've seen the people show up day in and day out and really struggle and work hard on these questions. And the task force that I work on was only a small part of a larger effort that started in 2008. So in September of 2008, the city of Charlottesville decided that the most important initiative that they could, their most important initiative was basically to talk about race relations in the city. And I think I've never lived in a place that would have said that that's their number one priority, especially in a year where Barack Obama was elected president. And I think even if I'd heard that, I think I would have said, okay, yeah, sure. Like, it's not uncommon for people to say, oh, what we really want is to talk about race. We want to really, emphasize diversity. But I think what's different about this was that out of that city council initiative came what the city calls the dialogue on race. And as a part of that dialogue on race, they had hundreds of hours of meetings that were open to the community where they could come and talk about their experiences. They had more than 1,000 people come regularly meet to talk about how they were going to reconcile some of the history of Charlottesville and make it better for themselves in this period and in the future. They established work groups. So they have an education work group. They have a social cultural work group that's focused on how art might help express people's feelings about the past and what they want the future to look like. So they have all of this time and effort that they've spent, and the people who came on that day probably weren't at those meetings, probably weren't struggling with those really hard questions, right? And as I said, I think that that's a large part of why they were a target. So when I think about this as being Constitution Day, I think about how it is that Charlottesville even thought that race relations should be a priority. And I think in preparing for today, I thought, well, we normally think of the Constitution as something that is protective and something that is supposed to protect us against the government depriving us of our rights. And I think that one thing that Charlottesville illustrates is how the Constitution can also be used as a weapon. And that is really reflective of the history that then ultimately led up to what happened this past month. And what I mean by that is essentially eminent domain. So you may know that the statute of Robert E. Lee that was the focus of the protest was constructed in 1924. What you may not know was that the property, the land that the statute sits on, was actually taken from black residents of Charlottesville via eminent domain before they put it on that piece of land. The other thing I think that kind of you should know is that Charlottesville is a place of transients for the most part, right? And most people are there for the college town, they're not there for very long. I think one thing that distinguishes people who kind of have a more active role in the community and those that don't is whether you've heard of the story of Vinegar Hill and what Charlottesville was like during the time of desegregation. And so one of the more sort of infamous stories about that is that after Brown v. Board in 1954, rather than integrate the schools, Charlottesville actually closed the schools at the directive of the governor. So you have one woman, for example, Olivia Ferguson, who didn't actually obtain her high school diploma from the Charlottesville High School until 2013. So they closed down the schools. When that happened, white parents sent their kids to private schools or organized schools in basements, and the black families basically had to do without, essentially. Around that same time, what is now known as sort of downtown Charlottesville was really a thriving, actually sort of an example of the kind of success that could happen in the South even after the Civil War. They had a really large black middle class, lots of doctors, lawyers. There was a part of town near downtown that had more than 30 black-owned businesses. It's where the black high schools were. There were lots of black teachers. And in about 1964, the city decided that they needed to have an urban renewal program, and they bulldozed this neighborhood and displaced 500 upper middle class families, and then as sort of eminent domain requires, you have to be compensated in some way. Well, their form of compensation was to build a housing project, which still exists today, and it's the West Haven Housing Project. So they closed the schools, they bulldozed places where families lived, and they ended up with a situation where there was sort of a mass exodus from the city. Right, so people were kind of just like, you know what, I guess I can't live here anymore. My kid needs to be educated. I need some place to live, and I don't want to be forced to live in low-income housing. And I think that those are some of the things that Charlottesville is still dealing with today. They still, only now are some of those people who were displaced in the 60s sort of moving back and trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that they have to walk by or drive by property every day that was taken from their families and where their families were slaves. And so that is, I think, the acknowledgement of the pain and the dishonor of what happened there was what started Charlottesville's process of talking about race in 2008. There was at least an acknowledgement that this is something that we couldn't ignore and that needed to be dealt with. And when I think about what happened in this past month, I think that what I hope is that even though I believe that part of Charlottesville's willingness to look at ugly truths is what led them to be a target, I hope that that's not something that discourages other people from doing the same thing, because I think we can either let that scare us or just talk louder, and I hope we do the latter and not the former.